Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We hear the word scandal thrown around a lot in politics, but honestly, what does that actually mean? To figure that out, we're going to use the major controversies of Justin Trudeau's administration as real-world case studies to untangle the often confusing boundaries between our legal, ethical, and moral rulebooks. By the end of this explainer, I promise you'll have a much sharper lens for viewing political news. Let's get into it.
Here is our roadmap. We'll define the three frameworks, look at personal ethics violations, explore the appearance of conflict, dive into management and procurement failures, examine crossing the legal line, and finally wrap up with how we judge leaders.
Section 1. Defining the three frameworks. Before we get into the messy stuff, we absolutely need to establish the rules of the game. Words like illegal and unethical aren't just interchangeable, even though we basically use them that way in everyday conversation. So let's start with the legal framework. A behavior is legal if it complies with the law. It's defined by governments, and it's enforced by the police and the courts. The consequences here are super severe. We're talking fines, sanctions, or straight-up jail time. But here is the crucial point to remember. Something can be perfectly legal, complying with the exact letter of the law, even if the public absolutely hates the action. Think about aggressive tax avoidance, right? Nobody likes it, but it keeps you out of jail.
Next up, we have the ethical framework. Now, ethics are usually way stricter than the law. These are the professional or institutional rules about proper conduct. They focus heavily on things like conflicts of interest and fairness. They're enforced by regulators. In our case today, that's Canada's Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. The consequences here? Well, they aren't jail time. Instead, you're looking at professional reprimands, suspensions, or losing your job.
And finally, we have the moral framework. This is easily the broadest and, frankly, most subjective category. Morality is defined by our personal, cultural, or societal beliefs about what is right and wrong. It's enforced purely by social approval or disapproval, and the main consequence is the loss of reputation and social trust. This means a perfectly legal and entirely ethical action might still be judged as deeply morally wrong by society.
In the real world, these three frameworks do not always line up. Take civil disobedience or a protest, for example. Often, it is strictly illegal, but a lot of people might view it as totally morally justified. On the flip side, think about a conflict of interest. It might completely bypass criminal penalties, staying perfectly legal, but it fails strict ethical codes, and society usually judges it as morally wrong. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces don't always fit.
Section 2. The personal ethics violations.
All right, now that we have our definitions locked in, let's test our personal ethics framework. We're going to look at two major controversies where official lines were undeniably crossed by the Prime Minister. And I want you to think about this number. 5. Across his tenure, Justin Trudeau has accumulated 5 individual contraventions of the Federal Conflict of Interest Act. That makes him the first sitting Prime Minister found to have violated the Act, and he actually holds the most confirmed violations of any Prime Minister under the current federal ethics regime. So where exactly did those 5 official violations come from? Well, 4 of them stem from the 2017 Aga Khan affair. Trudeau and his family took a vacation on a private island owned by the Aga Khan, whose organizations just so happened to have funding relationships with the Canadian government. The ethics commissioner found Trudeau failed to arrange his private affairs to avoid conflicts. He accepted inappropriate gifts, took private travel, and failed to recuse himself from decisions involving the Aga Khan. Then there's the 5th violation, which comes from the 2019 SNC-Lavalin affair. In that case, the Ethics Commissioner found Trudeau violated Section 9 of the Act by improperly attempting to influence then-Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. The goal? To help the engineering company avoid criminal prosecution for fraud and corruption.
The SNC-Lavalin affair brilliantly illustrates the real-world fallout when an ethical line gets crossed. This became a defining scandal because it raised massive constitutional questions about political pressure colliding with prosecutorial independence. It led to some huge high-profile cabinet resignations, including Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, plus the resignation of Trudeau's close advisor, Gerald Butts. Now, supporters argued the government was legitimately trying to protect jobs in Quebec, while critics saw it as protecting a politically important corporation from justice. But remember our frameworks. The official finding here was a breach of ethics, not a breach of criminal law.
Section 3. The appearance of conflict.
Let's move into the gray area of ethics. Fast forward to 2020 and the massive $900 million We Charity scandal. The government outsourced a pandemic-era student volunteer program to a charity that had previously paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in speaking fees and expenses to members of Trudeau's family. But here is the fascinating part. Unlike SNC-Lavalin, where a clear violation was found, Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion concluded that Trudeau did not actually violate the Conflict of Interest Act here. The evidence showed the nonpartisan civil service had actually recommended We Charity because of the incredible speed and scale required during the pandemic, and Trudeau didn't improperly influence that recommendation.
However, there's a big but here. The commissioner heavily criticized the severe appearance of a conflict. You know the old saying, right? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, people are going to assume it's a duck. Trudeau himself even acknowledged later that he should have recused himself from the cabinet discussions. This is a perfect textbook example of our frameworks in action. The WE Charity situation essentially passed the strict legal and ethical rulebooks because the Act doesn't treat a mere appearance of conflict as an actual legal contravention, but it completely failed the moral optics test for many Canadians, and it severely damaged social trust.
Section 4. Management and procurement failures.
Shifting gears from personal conduct to huge systemic issues, we arrive at ArriveCan. This was a pandemic travel app whose costs ballooned to an estimated $59.5 million. I mean, that is one pricey app. But here's the thing. There were no personal ethics violations or criminal charges leveled at Justin Trudeau himself over this. Instead, Auditor General Karen Hogan investigated and found what she called a glaring disregard for basic management and contracting practices by government departments. A small firm called GC Strategies received millions with barely any documentation explaining why. So, while it wasn't a personal ethics breach by the Prime Minister, opposition parties strongly argued it was a profound failure of his government's ethical responsibility to properly manage taxpayer money.
Section 5. Crossing the legal line.
For our final case study, we're looking at a scenario where the state itself crossed a hard legal boundary during the 2022 Freedom Convoy protests. In response to the blockades, the government used unprecedented emergency powers, which even included freezing bank accounts. But in January 2024, Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley delivered a massive judicial rebuke. He ruled that the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act was unlawful. He found the decision unreasonable and unjustified under the super strict statutory test required by the Act. On top of that, he ruled that certain emergency measures, like freezing those financial accounts, actually infringed upon charter protections against unreasonable search and seizure and freedom of expression.
Now, this legal battle has been a fascinating roller coaster. It's totally vital to note that a prior public inquiry led by Justice Rouleau actually found the invocation justified. But an inquiry is very different from a judicial review. When it went to the federal court, Justice Mosley ruled it unlawful. Obviously, the government appealed, but fast forward to January 2026, and the Federal Court of Appeal unanimously dismissed the federal government's appeal, completely upholding Mosley's ruling. As of early 2026, the government has applied for leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. So, while Mosley didn't find the government acted in bad faith or with malicious intent, two levels of court have now officially ruled that the state exceeded its legal authority.
Section 6. How we judge leaders.
When we filter all these wild events through our three frameworks, we become so much more critical and informed as consumers of political news. Let's look at this final scorecard to anchor our analysis. It clearly separates actual rule-breaking from terrible management or severe moral misjudgments. The Aga Khan and SNC Lavalin affairs, those were official confirmed ethical violations of the Conflict of Interest Act. We Charity, a massive failure of moral optics and the appearance of conflict, but critically, no official ethical violation found against the Prime Minister. ArriveCan, a systemic government management failure rather than a personal presidential ethics breach. And the Emergencies Act, a scenario where the state's actions were ruled legally unreasonable by the courts.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway from all of this is clarity. When the next major political controversy breaks, and let's be real, there will always be a next one, ask yourself, which specific rulebook is actually being tested right now? Are we outraged because a leader broke the law? Because they violated strict professional ethics? Or simply because they made a decision we find morally unpopular? Because until we know the difference, we can't truly hold power to account. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.